Okay, so again, my name is Andrea Moe. I am with our Noxious Weeds program at the Nevada Department of Agriculture. This is probably going to be a little bit longer than 15 minutes, but I did try to keep it brief. But what I tried to do for you guys here today is provide kind of a general program overview of what we do with the Noxious Weeds program at the Nevada Department of Agriculture. We have a lot of different facets that we spend time on, and it's not just sitting down and working on weed control plans and things like that. So we just wanted to kind of educate folks about all the different services that we are able to provide, and then touch on some of the more specific aspects of noxious weeds as well. And again, if there are questions at the end, more than happy to answer those. So with that being said, our mission is to effectively coordinate resources and efforts toward proactive prevention, control, and management of invasive weed species in Nevada to benefit all land users in the state. Now, with that, we have a lot of different legs that we stand on to make that happen. One of the terms you'll frequently hear is integrated pest management. And when you follow IPM or integrated pest management properly, it's not just about controlling the weeds. It really does start from the very, very beginning with identifying problems and identifying goals, monitoring effective control, and then talking with people afterward. So integrated pest management, when done effectively, is not just about boots on the ground control efforts. So as part of that and what we do have our regulatory and enforcement aspects to our program. We are a regulatory body, but we also spend a lot of time on education and outreach efforts. A lot of people aren't aware of noxious weeds. They're not aware that they have them, or they're not aware of what a serious problem they can be. And so we really try to start with education first before we fall too heavily on the regulatory side of things. And then in addition to that, we have some other programs that we offer when we're out and about in the field that both help support this mission and can be of use to private producers in the state. So to start with just a very brief overview of the regulatory side of things, primarily we deal with Nevada Administrative Code 555. This has a lot of our backing, including our general provisions, our classifications. It justifies the weed-free certification program that I'll speak about. It also explains our weed control districts and lists their specifications, and it talks a lot about the different rules for different dealers of nursery stock. Of particular interest is NAC 555.010, and this is where our noxious weed list is actually housed, spelled out. It does include a complete list. Currently, there are 54 species on that list, and it also explains the different categories for those species between an A, a B, and a C. Now, those categories are important because they help us to prioritize. So not all noxious weeds are considered equally bad. Those in the category A are the ones that we tend to be the most aggressive with in our response. They're very scattered throughout the state. They're not well established yet. And in some cases, category A species might not yet even be present in the state of Nevada. So we're trying to hold some of those species at the border. Category B, much more widely distributed. Oftentimes they're found in most counties, if not all. And then category C are those that are the most widely distributed and the most well established. Now, just because category B and C are more well established, it doesn't mean we don't treat them. It doesn't mean we don't respond to them when we receive information. It does mean, however, that sometimes the priority is no longer eradication because it's just not always possible or practical with those B and C species especially. In addition to our NAC, we also have our NRS, our Nevada Revised Statutes. And again, 555 is where most of our laws tend to be housed. So the definition of a noxious weed is actually any species of plant which is or is likely to be a public nuisance, detrimental, or destructive and difficult to control. So something important to note here is that noxious weed is a legal term. It applies to that set of 54 species in NAC 555, and there's a legal process to add or change or amend that noxious weed list. So any plant that does not fall onto that list is not a noxious weed, cannot be considered a noxious weed by law. Additionally, there is language that prevents us from listing species if they are too widespread to be controlled. primarily because that would be unethical to try to control a species that is so widespread we cannot enforce it in a fair manner across the state. In addition to that, NRS is where it specifies that every landowner is required to control their noxious weeds. And this is true whether it's a private citizen or some sort of government entity, city, county, state, and federal. It doesn't matter whoever's property the noxious weeds fall on, it is the responsibility of that landowner to control the weeds. And then in addition, the state quarantine officer located here with us at the Nevada Department of Agriculture, it is our responsibility to serve notice and enforce the control of noxious weeds when they are identified on these properties. So when we talk about reporting noxious weeds, there's a couple of different ways that I'll go through that you can do this. One of the simplest is just to reach out to noxious weeds staff. I do have my contact information at the end of this presentation. We encourage people to reach out, give us a call, or send us an email with questions or concerns. Usually, what we will ask you to do at that point in time is fill out a noxious weed notification form on the website. It asks for some basic information for you, just so we can get in contact with you and ask questions if we need to. But really what we need is just a way to get a hold of you, again, for follow-up if necessary, a description of where the weed is found, your best guess at what you think it might be. See, we have our list down there, and you can go ahead and check a box by the appropriate species. And then pictures, which I don't show that on here, but there's a way to upload those pictures. And the pictures are super, super important. That's what ultimately lets us decide if you have a noxious weed complaint or if it's perhaps just a nuisance weed or something else. So when we're talking about identification, there's always a lot of interest in this and how to do it and how not to do it, so to speak. And photos that show detail of the specific plant are tremendously more helpful than kind of landscape photos. If you tell us that there is a patch of several acres, we can go out and verify that if we need to. But what's more important than the size and scope of the overall infestation is first just determining what weed species we are dealing with, again, to make sure it actually is on that noxious weed list. So when we're looking again for an identification photo, something that shows the flowers, the stems, the leaves in enough detail with enough clarity for us to be able to make an identification based solely off the picture is really appreciated and really useful. If you're able to upload additional photos to show kind of the scope and scale, that's great. But again, if you're including just one picture, we really appreciate it when it's something that we can make an identification based off of that photo. And to give you a couple of examples of that, leaf shape and structure is really important for identification. So being able to tell what the leaf looks like, how it attaches to the stem. Additionally, characteristics of the stem itself can be useful if it's round or square, if it's got a different color than the rest of the plant. When we're doing identifications, ideally, we would like to always identify plants as young and as possible, like you see in that middle photo there. That's very early immature growth. It's what we call a basal rosette. And that, again, is the best time to identify because it's the best time to treat. But the problem is most people don't tend to notice weeds when they're small and innocuous looking like that. We tend to get many more notifications when they're large and showy and in flower. So if there are flowers on the plant, then again, sending a close-up photo so we can look at not just the color, but the shape, the arrangement, the way the flowers are grouped, the way they attach to the stem. We also, if possible, appreciate any information that you have about the root and the base of the plant. And then pictures of the overall plant can be very helpful as well. But again, with enough clarity and detail that we can zoom in on features like the leaves and the stems if need be. So these photos are all for poison hemlock, with the exception of a couple of the leaves, which are on that last slide there. A couple of those leaves are from a close relative, western water hemlock. The rest of these photos are all poison hemlock. So again, when we're looking at an ID, that's kind of how we walk through the process. We're looking at the leaves, the stem, the roots, the flowers, and focusing on the way that those structures are arranged and any distinguishing features rather than things like color. I did throw just a couple of examples of some of our most prominent noxious weeds in here. Normally, if I'm going to talk identification, that is a 45-minute to 60-minute presentation just by itself. We go into a lot of detail to really help explain. But again, just to hit a couple of highlights here briefly for you guys. Yellow star thistle is a category A. It's one of the ones we're most concerned about invading the state, especially along our western edge where it's coming in from California. The flower is very showy, bright yellow, very robust yellow spines right under that flower head as well. And this is one that, because it is a category A, if you suspect you see it, we really appreciate a notification, a phone call, email us a picture, something so that we can go take a look at it. Now, the other two pictures on this slide, we have our puncture vine and our perennial pepperweed, or tall white top as it's also known. These two are both category C's. They're both very widespread. Odds are good you've probably seen them around before. Puncture vine, people also like to think of it as the goat head. It has those little thorns that we've all stepped on at one point in our lives. And one thing I do like to remind people is, even though most people are familiar with goat heads, not everyone knows it actually is a listed noxious species. So bear in mind, it is a noxious weed. We do want to control it when we see it. And something else to remember is those thorns that we step on are actually the seeds of the puncture vine. So when we pull those thorns out of our shoes, out of our bike tires, out of your dog's paw, we don't want to just throw those back on the ground. What you're doing there is actually replanting those seeds. Try to remember to throw them in the garbage instead. And that's always true of any plant material that you're dealing with. If you're not sure what it is, it's always better to just put it in the trash can. That way it doesn't have the potential to spread and become a new infestation. Now, our perennial pepperweed or tall white top, again, very prevalent in Northwest Nevada in particular. It dries out and can stay pretty persistent with the dead stems into the fall. As the name implies, it is a perennial species, which means it comes back year after year after year, in addition to spreading through those seeds that it produces in those white flowers at the top. And this one, when it gets into riparian areas, can really take over pretty aggressively and be a big problem. A lot of our complaints and a lot of our efforts in weed control are spent on knapweeds and on thistles. The problem is these are probably some of the most difficult to identify, with the exception of grasses. So when we're talking about identification, we prefer not to rely on flower color. You can see we have 3 different species with those seed heads, and despite that, the color is very similar between all 3, and in the case of one of them, it actually is 2 different colors for the same species there. So flower color can vary based on site characteristics, resource availability, things like that. So when we're doing identifications, the structures that we look at are, again, that basal rosette, that first growth of immature leaves on the ground, how they're shaped, what color they are, how they're attached to the stem, how that overall stem is shaped. And then when we look at the flowers themselves, rather than color, we're going to look at the structures right under the colored point of the flower. And these are called bracts. And these are actually what allow us to usually make our identifications, whether they're dark and spotted in the case of the spotted knapweed, papery and fine in the case of the Russian knapweed, or the diffuse knapweed up top if they have those kind of bristles and spines. Very similar story then for our thistles. Again, just to hit a couple of highlights for some of our most common thistles here. Canada thistle, musk thistle, and Scotch thistle are all noxious. Bull thistle is invasive and non-native, but it is not listed as a noxious weed. However, you can see it looks very similar to the others, so we normally still talk about it for identification purposes, for exclusionary purposes. So in the case of the thistles, again, very similar flower color. So instead, we look at the shape of the leaf, the way the leaf attaches to the stem, and then the characteristics of those bracts or those structures right underneath the colored part of the flower. We can also look at the shape of the flower. So if you see the difference between the musk thistle, which is very flat on the top and the bottom, compared to the way the bull thistle is more tapered, Scotch thistle tends to be much rounder. And then there's a very clear size difference as well between some of these species, the Canada thistle being very evidently smaller, and then shaped much more oval-like compared to the other species as well. So again, all of these thistle species are prevalent, and Canada thistle tends to prefer water and be a riparian weed compared to the others. We oftentimes see it in agricultural settings. It really likes irrigation ditches. Musk and Scotch thistle really can grow across a very wide variety of habitats. And then bull thistle oftentimes prefers a little bit more water than the others as well. But it's kind of the most intermediary species. It's not as riparian growing as the Canada thistle normally tends to be. So again, just a very brief identification overview. The best way to get identification help is I frequently give talks for CEUs, where again, we just spend an hour focused on identification, or to reach out to the Noxious Weeds program with some pictures, and we can help you out through there. In addition to the identification, which kind of is the way we bridge the gap between regulatory and enforcement and education and outreach, is when we provide those talks and really talk about how to tell what weeds you're dealing with. We also have some resources that can help with things like that. So we do have our Nevada Noxious Weed Field Guide. It has all of our noxious species in it. It includes photos, it includes descriptions, and then it also includes control recommendations. So it's a very handy little field guide. We've also developed something called our Quick Reference Guide. We have a spring version and a fall version. And what it is a list of all of our noxious species, several different control measures such as hand pulling, herbicide, grazing, and then just a really basic little color key that tells you if, say, grazing is effective on a certain species in the spring or in the fall, or if not at all. So those are available on our website and can be a quick, easy way to just get a good idea of how to start treating a weed in many cases. So in addition to providing education on identification, we also spend more time and go into more detail about the different noxious weed laws and regulations, different control measures for dealing with these noxious weeds, and again, integrated pest management or integrated weed management as the case may be. Weed-free materials program, which I'll talk about today. And then I'll also briefly mention our biocontrol program and EDDMaps. We also work with Play Clean Go, which is a really neat organization that tries to remind people that when you go out and have fun in the landscape, remember to clean before you go. And that's not just talking about trash. It's really also talking about invasive species. People might have heard of clean, drain, dry as well. So for boat etiquette when moving from place to place, and the same applies for weeds. We want to make sure if we go out on a hike, before we leave that site, we clean off our boots, we clean off our pant legs and our socks, we brush down the dog or the horse, and we leave any of that weed material on site, or better yet, in the garbage, instead of taking it with us when we go to a new location. So to cover EDDMaps, EDDMaps is a citizen science tool, but it's also used by professionals in the weeds world to map invasive species. We greatly encourage and appreciate participation of other people with this app. It is a free app as well as a free website. It has a lot of really neat tools. And what it allows is for anybody who comes across a noxious weed to go ahead and make a report about that weed that then the Nevada Department of Agriculture has access to. So if someone is out on the landscape, they think they see something that might be a noxious weed, you can pull up the app, or you can go through the website. There's a very simple little reporting form. You take a picture, you get some Latin longs, which it will input automatically for you on the app. And then from there, you're able to make a report, which will go into your queue. You can see that in the right-hand picture there. And then once you upload that queue and upload that report, that goes into a verification list. All those reports come to verifiers at the Nevada Department of Agriculture. We're able to take a look at that picture, determine if it is a noxious weed or not. If it is a noxious weed, then we can let it into our database. And from there, it just helps us keep track of what's going on out there on the landscape. We especially appreciate the use of EDDMaps in the case of what we call EDRR species. These are our early detection and rapid response species. So things like yellow star thistle on that category A list that we are very concerned about, that we don't have a lot of in the state as of yet. When we get an EDDMaps report, it really helps us identify where those problems are and be able to respond effectively and hopefully capture the problem before it gets out of hand. This also really is helpful for groups like conservation districts and CWMAs, cooperative weed management areas. If they're looking for funding to help with their weed management, this is a great way for them to kind of do some of that mapping and be able to provide some data. It comes up with these distribution maps that are publicly accessible. So anyone can actually go pull up EDDMaps on the website and take a look and see what weeds are nearby. You can zoom all the way into those individual points that break out from those clusters, all the way down to click on an individual record, and that will give you information on what the weed is, where it is, when it was found, and usually there's a photo in there as well to help with identification. There are a lot of different ways you can play around with those maps, and they have other identification tools and things like that on the website as well. So again, it is a free app as well as a free website. It does exist on Android and on iPhone. The layouts are slightly different, but they do function the same. And in addition to trainings on laws and identification and other things like that, we also do provide trainings specifically just on EDDMaps, how to use it and how to make it the most effective tool possible for your circumstances. And then to close up with just a couple of our other programs that, again, we do have and do operate out of the Department of Ag Noxious Weeds program. Our biocontrol program is where we use insects and fungi primarily to help reduce the density and limit the spread of different noxious weeds infestations. Biocontrol is a very specific program. It's not always appropriate to use it because a biocontrol agent will never eradicate an infestation. If it were to do that, it would also be eradicating its food source and it would cause itself to die out. So biocontrol is used when we have huge monocultures that are just out of control and we have limited resources to try to do anything else. So they're a good way to, again, they reduce density by feeding on the seeds. They prevent spread by preventing seeds from maturing, but they're not a complete control measure. They're not an eradication measure as a standalone function. But we're primarily focusing on Russian knapweed, Canada thistle, and leafy spurge. And we are always on the lookout for new appropriate sites if they do meet the specific criteria for biocontrol. Then we do have some options that we can offer in those cases. And then finally, our weed-free program, our weed-free certification. The Nevada Department of Agriculture operates our weed-free program under a memorandum of understanding with the North American Invasive Species Management Association, or NIASMA. This entity has national and international now minimum standards. Canada is a cooperator as well. And these minimum standards allow for the inspection of forage, straw, mulch, and gravel products, and the certification of these products as being weed-free. Weed-free products are required on a variety of different land types in the state of Nevada. The Forest Service is one of our most prominent examples. They do have signage posted in a variety of places across the state. You can see a lot of our production of weed-free gravel and forage takes place kind of around the vicinity, again, of northwestern Nevada. We have a lot out in Douglas County, but we are starting to see it pick up elsewhere across the state as well. And then again, this year, for the first time, we are now able to offer weed-free mulch as well. And we do have 2 producers who are certified for mulch as of right now, one in Carson City and one down in Amargosa Valley. So we are working on trying to build a number of sources of all of these different product types across the state to make them available, both to government when we're doing rehabilitation projects or road work, things like that, as well as to private individuals who are interested or have a need. Weed-free products are always designated. In the case of gravel and mulch, it's strictly by paperwork. In the case of the forage, there is the associated paperwork, but we also use a specific purple and gold double-stranded twine. This twine can only be purchased through the Nevada Department of Agriculture after an inspection and certification have taken place. So that twine is regulated. It is carefully used only on certified bales. And again, it just helps with the tracking of where those weed-free materials go. When we certify, regardless of the product type, what we're looking at is a visual inspection of the site. We check the perimeter, we check the product itself, storage areas, parking areas, and we want to make sure that we don't have any weeds, not only in the product, but nearby as well. I think I'm still good. My screen just did something there. All right.
Looks like your presentation might have ended and we just went to the screen of everyone who's attending.
Okay.
If you had more slides.
And you spread it all along a roadside, ultimately what you're doing is spreading that noxious weed problem wherever that gravel ends up going. You're amplifying what you need to treat. You're amplifying what you need to deal with in the future. It's always better to just treat the source and use a clean source of materials rather than inviting trouble later down the road. So our weed-free program is something that we spend a lot of time with out in the field during the summer season. Again, working with gravel, forage, and now mulch. And it's something that we really strongly encourage people to use whenever possible. And it would encourage anybody who is a producer, if you're interested, to please reach out and I can get you some more information about that as well. With that being said, that was all I have for you. I will throw my contact information into the chat here. And again, the goal of this presentation today is we have a lot of different aspects to the Noxious Weeds program. So please feel free to reach out, and we want to be an educational resource first and foremost for you guys. You have my contact information there, as well as the Noxious Weeds at agri.nv.gov is just a general program email that will go to myself, as well as the other people in the program, Jake, Dick, and Megan Brown. And we all monitor that email address. So again, any questions, more than happy to take them, and please feel free to reach out.